Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Turkey. Now, Turkey holds a unique position at the moment. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a polarisation of opinion. A lot of countries have come out against Russia's invasion. We've seen sanctions applied, we've seen trade being stopped, and there is a general consensus that a lot of countries will never do business with Russia again. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got countries that have increased the amount of trade that they're doing with Russia. Now, Turkey sits right in the middle because it's a member of NATO, so therefore is an ally of most of the countries in the West who've sanctioned Russia. But it's also continued to have a strong relationship with Russia. So it's therefore got a foot in both camps. And President Erdogan has had a number of meetings with President Putin of Russia over the course of the last 18 months, whereby he's stipulated that they want to do more trade with Russia whilst maintaining their position as a member of NATO, and also they're waiting to join the EU. Now, they have been waiting for quite a long time, around 24 years, so don't hold your breath on that one. So Turkey has managed to get itself to a position where it's everybody's friend. But over the course of the last week or so, there has been a slight change in the relationship between Turkey and Russia. Turkey supports a number of different countries in conflicts around the world, and one of those situations is in Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan is a country that was previously part of the old Soviet Union, and in 1991 it gained its independence alongside its neighbour Armenia. And between the two countries there is a disputed territory. It's actually been designated as being part of Azerbaijan, but the majority of people in that area are Armenian, and this has caused a number of wars over the course of the last 30 years. Now, Turkey has a close affinity with Azerbaijan and therefore has been supporting it in this conflict, whereas Russia has been supporting Armenia. And the last time that this issue erupted into a military conflict, Russia actually stepped in as a peacekeeper, and they have troops posted on the ground to maintain the peace. However, over the course of the last week or so, the military conflict kicked back up again, and Azerbaijan, who are supported by Turkey, decided that they wanted to take full control of this area. And obviously at the moment, Russia is not really in a position to be getting involved in another warfare because they're fully occupied by what's going on in Ukraine. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of what's been going on in Azerbaijan, and we'll talk about the involvement of Turkey and Russia and what the implications for the outcome are for the ongoing relationship between the two nations. We'll also go on to have a look at what's been going on in the Turkish economy. The Turkish authorities have announced another whopping 500 basis point increase in their interest rates, and they're now standing at 30%. So we've seen an increase of 21.5% in the space of 3 months. That's just incredible. So have a look at what's going on with interest rates, what's happening with inflation, because that's one of the main reasons that interest rates are being hiked. We'll talk about the economic policy, because that's changed completely since President Erdogan was re-elected. We'll talk about what's happening with everybody's favourite entrepreneur, Elon Musk, who recently met up with President Erdogan. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is going on in Turkey and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, once again, thank you so much for all of the positive messages you've been sending me. Really appreciate it. It's great to hear that most of you are pleased to see me back on screen. And if you would like to see more videos like this, especially ones that I'm not posting onto YouTube, then please check out my Patreon channel, where you'll find lots of other interesting videos, as well as being able to watch all of these sort of videos without any annoying adverts. But if you don't like Patreon and you'd like to support the channel, please check out the section below, where you'll find links to buy me a coffee, as well as YouTube's super thanks and membership. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, Turkey has a close affinity with Azerbaijan, and as a result of that, it's been supporting Azerbaijan in the conflict over the disputed territory, and Russia has been supporting Armenia. So once again, Turkey and Russia find themselves on the opposite side of a military conflict. So let's have a look why there is a disputed area and what's been happening since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The main dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan is the region known as Nagorno Karabakh, which is an area that's officially designated as being part of Azerbaijan, but is predominantly occupied by Armenians.
Nagorno Karabakh is at the center of the conflict. It's a mountainous region within Azerbaijan and is internationally recognized as part of it. But it's known as Artsakh by Armenians, and its 120,000 inhabitants are predominantly ethnic Armenians. They have their own government, which is close to Armenia, but not officially recognized by it or any other country. Armenians, who are Christians, claim a presence in the area dating back several centuries before Christ. Azerbaijan, whose inhabitants are mostly Turkic Muslims, also claim deep historical ties. Bloody conflict between the two peoples goes back more than a century. Armenia and Azerbaijan were both members of the Soviet Union, and in the 3 decades since its collapse, they've already fought 2 wars. One that took place between 1988 and 1994, and a second that lasted 44 days in 2020. Over the course of the 2 wars, tens of thousands died. In the first war, over 1 million people were displaced. Most of those were Azeris, driven from their homes when Armenia ended up with control over Nagorno Karabakh. In the second, Azerbaijan managed to take back a third of Nagorno Karabakh. Russia brokered a ceasefire between the two, providing peacekeepers to guard the Lachin Corridor, a crucial road that connects the territory to Armenia. Tensions started ratcheting up again when a group of Azerbaijani civilians, identifying themselves as environmental activists, began blocking the Lachin Corridor. An Azerbaijan checkpoint was set up, blocking the flow of goods to Armenia. It caused what the US called a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation.
On the streets of Stepanakert, the main city in Nagorno-Karabakh, panic took over as mortars pounded its surroundings. This ethnic Armenian-dominated enclave and self-declared breakaway territory is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. But it is controlled by ethnic Armenians and has close links to the Armenian government.
The latest military conflict only lasted for a matter of 48 hours before Russia stepped in with a peacekeeping proposal. And under this proposal, Azerbaijan now has full control over this contested area. And as a result of that, there has been a mass exodus of the Armenian people who've been living there. As mentioned in the video, around 120,000 Armenians live in this region. And they are now concerned that they're going to be victimized and live under an oppressive society. So most of them don't want that situation. They would rather up sticks and move back to Armenia. And this represents a really interesting outcome, because when you look at what's been happening over the course of the last 30 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, there have been 2 major wars, one of which lasted for a number of years and the other of which lasted for 44 days. And at the end of both of those, there was a peacekeeping resolution whereby the Armenians were able to continue living in this region. And in fact, they had their own government and their own rules and regulations. And Azerbaijan were prepared to accept that because Russia was standing behind Armenia. And ultimately, Azerbaijan didn't want to take on the might of Russia. But the situation we've got today is very different. As a direct result of Russia's involvement in Ukraine, it's devoting all of its military efforts and a lot of its finances to keeping that war going. And as I've mentioned in other videos, President Putin has stipulated that he's prepared to allow an unlimited budget to keep this war going until Russia gets a positive outcome. So it's fully committed to what's happening in Ukraine. And that means that Russia is completely stretched. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that the finances of the Russian economy are really thin at the moment. They're posting large deficits and having to draw down on the National Wealth Fund to fund the war effort. And as a result of that, Russia simply doesn't have the ability or the cash to be able to get involved in another conflict. And as a result of that, Azerbaijan, who are supported by Turkey, have taken the opportunity to step in and seize full control of this area that's been contested for over 100 years. And that is a really interesting development. And you have to ask the question as to whether or not Turkey and Azerbaijan have come up with a strategy here, because they know that Russia is vulnerable right now and unlikely to want to get involved in any prolonged warfare. They decided that this was an opportune moment to step in and seize something that's been on their agenda for a long period of time. And I am sure that Russia will be very unhappy about this situation. And they know that Turkey supports Azerbaijan. And even though Turkey have not come out and made any official statements as to what's happened, their long-term ally has now benefited from what's going on. And I think this is a really interesting development, not just for Azerbaijan and Armenia, but also for Turkey and Russia. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Turkey over the course of the last 12 months. And what this shows is that since the re-election of President Erdogan and the change of policy away from the previous Erdoganomics, whereby rates are being reduced at a time of high inflation, there have been 4 consecutive rate increases. On the 22nd of June, when rates were increased by 6.5%, from 8.5% to 15%, on the 20th of July when rates were increased further to 17.5%, on the 24th of August when there was a 7.5% increase to 25%, and then on the 21st of September rates were increased by a further 5% to the current level of 30%. So over the course of the last 3 months, interest rates have increased from 8.5% to 30% in Turkey. And this is clearly a very aggressive move by the authorities in Turkey. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian central bank increased its interest rates from 7.75% to 20%. So that represented an increase of 12.5%. So the recent increases that have been introduced by Turkey are higher than the change in Russia, and that was a wartime economy. And that really puts into perspective how aggressive these movements are. Now, in terms of what's the likely impact, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it takes time for the change in interest rates to feed through both into the economy and into people's psyche. It can be anything from 3 to 12 months before the full impact of those changes is felt. So even though we've seen rapid increases in interest rates, it's very unlikely to have an overnight impact. And in fact, what we've seen in the inflation data is that inflation has actually started going up since interest rates have been increased. This chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation in Turkey over the course of the last 12 months. And what this shows is that in September 2022, inflation was running at an incredibly high rate of 83% and actually remained above 83% in October and November. But between December 2022 and June 2023, Turkey saw month-on-month falls in inflation, and by June 23, the rate was down to 38%, which is still incredibly high, but is a lot lower than 85%. However, unfortunately for Turkey, over the course of the last couple of months, inflation has started rising rapidly again and hit 48% in July, and the latest figures for August showed that the rate of inflation is now almost 59%. And in terms of putting that into perspective, Turkey currently has the second highest rate of inflation out of all of the countries in the G20, which historically were the 20 largest economies in the world. The only economy that has a higher rate of inflation is Argentina, where it's now 124%, so completely off the scale. And if you're interested in finding out what's going on in Argentina, please check out the video that I posted recently. And if we compare Turkey with every country in the world, there are only 6 which have a higher rate of inflation, which are Venezuela, Lebanon, Syria, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Sudan. And every single one of those countries is in a state of financial crisis. So this really puts into perspective how big the problem is in Turkey right now. This chart shows the percentage increase in food prices in Turkey over the course of the last 12 months. And as we've discussed in previous videos, food inflation is a really important metric because it's indiscriminate. Everybody has to buy food, and therefore it has a bigger impact on the poorest members of society because those people are spending a much larger percentage of their income on food. It can be as much as 80 or 90%. And if you look at what's been happening with food prices in Turkey over the last 12 months, you can see why there is such a problem in the country right now. In September 2022, food prices increased year on year by more than 93%. And by November of last year, the increase was more than 100%. Now, the trend of this chart is exactly the same as what we've just seen for general prices. Between December 2022 and May 2023, there was a reduction in the increase of food prices. However, by May, food prices were still increasing by more than 52%, which is still an astronomical level. But unfortunately for the people of Turkey, since May, there has now been a renewal in the rate of increase of food prices. And the most recent figures for August 2023 show that over the last 12 months, food prices have increased by almost 73%. Now, to put that into context, that means that the poorest members of society, to maintain the amount of food that they're buying, would have had to see an increase in their income of 73% over that same period. And that hasn't been happening, unfortunately. So what that means in real terms is that people are now spending a larger proportion of their monthly income on food. And if you don't have the capacity to be able to increase that spend, the bottom line is that you will end up buying less food. Because if you've only got a certain amount of cash, it means that you can only buy a certain amount of food. And we have a situation in Turkey right now, similar to other countries around the world, where people are cutting back on the amount of food that they're buying and therefore are eating less. And if we jump back to look at the monthly movements in inflation, there has actually been a change of policy in Turkey over the course of the last few months. Following President Erdogan's re-election in May, he replaced his entire economic team and appointed Mehmet Şimşek as the finance minister. And this was a pivotal moment because prior to this, President Erdogan had been operating what was known as Erdoganomics, whereby he believed that at times of high inflation, rather than increasing interest rates to discourage spending, he decided the right thing to do was to reduce interest rates. And as a result of that policy, inflation rose from around 20% in Turkey to more than 85%. But the new finance team and the new finance minister follow a traditional policy of increasing interest rates at times of high inflation. And that's exactly what we've seen over the course of the last few months. But unfortunately, from Turkey's point of view, as you can see from this chart, inflation has started to increase in Turkey at the same time that interest rates are increasing. And the reason for this is that it takes time for the impact of changes in interest rates to really feed through into the economy and into people's psyche. Generally speaking, there is a lag of between 3 and 6 months. So it's going to take time, and Turkey needs to show its patience with this new policy. And President Erdogan recently came out and stated that he is fully supportive of the new approach and the new policy. And in view of this new approach, the Turkish government has now adjusted its forecasts for 2023 and 2024. It is now forecasting 65% inflation by the end of 2023, compared with the original forecast of 24.9%. And in 2024, it's now expecting inflation to be 33%, compared to the original forecast of 13.8%. So this marks a huge increase in terms of the expected rate of inflation, but I think is a lot more realistic than the original forecasts, particularly in view of the fact that at that time, Turkey was reducing interest rates to try to bring inflation back down, and that policy really isn't proven to be successful. And alongside its inflation forecasts, Turkey have also forecast that GDP will be less for 2023. They're now forecasting 4.4%, compared with the original forecast of 5%. And for 2024, the GDP growth forecast has been reduced to 4%, compared with 5.5% from the previous set of figures. And finally, Turkey has forecast that the current account deficit is expected to be $42.5 billion in 2023 and $34.7 billion in 2024. This chart shows the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Turkish lira over the course of the last 5 years. And the reason that I wanted to go back 5 years is to show the rapid deterioration in the value of the lira that was seen between the end of 2021 and the middle of 2022. So what this chart shows is that at the end of September 2018, one US dollar was trading for around 6.5 Turkish lira. And 3 years later, at the end of September 2021, one US dollar was trading for around 9 Turkish lira, which represents a fall in value of around 30% over a 3-year period. However, September 2021 was the time when President Erdogan decided that he wanted to introduce Erdoganomics, whereby he decided to tackle high rates of inflation by reducing interest rates. And this was contrary to the accepted principle that when you have high inflation, you increase interest rates to discourage people from taking on more debt and from spending. Now, the direct result of the multiple interest rate reductions was that inflation rose from around 20% to more than 85%. And as you can see from this chart, that had a devastating impact on the Turkish lira. And in the 12 months between September 21 and September 22, the exchange rate against $1 reduced from 9 Turkish lira to more than 18, which represents a huge fall in value over that period. Now, if we change the scale of this chart and have a look at what's been happening over the last 12 months, you can see that there's been some very interesting movements. After President Erdogan was re-elected in May, the value of the lira fell significantly, from an exchange rate of around 20 Turkish lira to $1 to around 27 Turkish lira. However, interestingly, since the middle of July, the rate of decline in the value of the lira has reduced significantly, and this corresponds with the change in strategy. Turkey is now following a traditional policy whereby it's increasing its interest rates to try to bring down the high rates of inflation. And as we saw earlier, that policy hasn't really had any major impact yet. In fact, inflation is continuing to go up. But the markets are viewing this as a positive step, and the value of the lira has stabilised over the course of the last couple of months. But of course, the proof of the pudding will be what happens over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. Will we see the rate of increase in inflation starting to calm down? And if we do, will that mean that we have a stable period in terms of the value of the lira? Or will inflation continue to skyrocket and therefore devalue the lira even further?
Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan asked Elon Musk to build a Tesla factory in Turkey, according to Turkish officials on Monday. The country's communications directorate said the Tesla CEO told Erdogan many of the country's suppliers already worked with Tesla. He also said Turkey was one of the most important candidates for its next factory. Tesla did not immediately respond to requests for comment. The news was reported by Anadolu Agency, which said Erdogan and Musk spoke during a meeting at Turkish House in New York. Erdogan is in the US to attend the UN General Assembly. Turkish officials said the president told Musk Turkey was open to cooperation on Starlink and artificial intelligence. Starlink is the satellite internet venture of Musk's SpaceX. They added Musk reportedly said SpaceX wanted to work with Turkish authorities to gain the license to offer Starlink satellite services in the country. It also said Erdogan invited Musk to attend Turkish Aerospace and Technology Festival Technofest at the end of September. It cited Musk as saying he would gladly attend. Musk said in May that Tesla would probably pick a location for a new factory by the end of this year.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video to give you an update as to what's happening in Turkey. And as you've seen, there is a lot going on, both in the economy and also in the political arena. As you saw from the data, worryingly, inflation is now on the rise again in Turkey and is now touching 60%, which means that Turkey is the 7th highest inflation rate in the world. That is a major warning sign. And up until recently, President Erdogan was following his contrarian policy of reducing interest rates at a time of high inflation. But he's now decided to change that policy and go to a more traditional method. And over the course of the last few months, we've seen interest rates rise from 8.5% to 30%. Now that is an incredible pace of increase, and 30% rate of interest is very, very high. And as I mentioned earlier, it will take time for those increases to feed through and have the impact that they're looking for. So inflation is unlikely to come down rapidly, and maybe not even in 2023. It might be until 2024 before we start seeing inflation starting to turn the corner. So there's a lot of pain ahead in terms of the people in Turkey. And as we saw from the data, food inflation is already at sky-high rates, above 70%. So if that keeps increasing, it's going to put more and more pressure on the poorer members of society who are already struggling. So there's a lot going on in the economy right now. But what we've also seen is that Turkey, who has this really unusual position in terms of the world of politics, whereby it's a friend of Russia, but it's also a member of NATO and has strong relations with Europe. So it's got a foot in every single camp. And over the course of the last week, we've seen a slight change in that relationship. Historically, Turkey has been backing Azerbaijan in its conflict against Armenia, who've been backed by Russia. And up until now, the situation has been pretty much a stalemate. We haven't really seen any movement forward on either side. They've had a couple of wars over the course of the last 30 years, but haven't really got a resolution. They've ended up with the same situation that they had before the wars. However, over the course of the last week, Azerbaijan has really strengthened its position, and the peacekeeping agreement that was put forward by Russia effectively hands full control of this area over to Azerbaijan. So essentially, Azerbaijan has won in its conflict over this disputed territory. Now that is obviously a victory for Azerbaijan, but also for Turkey because they've been supporting them. Now that isn't going to sit particularly well with President Putin and Russia. However, the problem Russia has is that it's not in a position to be able to fund any further military conflict at the moment. And the last thing that they need to do is start sending their troops into other territories when they're fully occupied and already under pressure in Ukraine. And I think this is a really interesting development for two reasons. Firstly, it potentially changes the relationship between Russia and Turkey, and we'll have to see how that pans out over the course of the next few months. But secondly, it also shows us that Russia is struggling right now. When the last war in this area kicked off in 2020, Russia was quick to step in and provide support. However, right now, it's not in a position to do that. And that does throw up the question as to whether or not there might be more military conflict over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, where people who previously have been backed by Russia may feel vulnerable, and there could be an opportunity for the opposition to seize their advantage if they know that Russia is unlikely to provide further support in the near future. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.